Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first program of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's 2020 8-week Great Decision Series, with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association of America. My name is Jeff Haverdank, and I serve as Calvin's Associate Director of Gift Planning here at Calvin University. On behalf of President Leroy and the faculty, staff, and students of Calvin, I thank you for your attendance, which indicates an abiding interest in global awareness and international relations. We are pleased to host the Great Decision Series at Calvin because the series fits seamlessly with the university's mission. Calvin University equips students to think deeply, to act justly, and to live wholeheartedly as Christ agents of renewal in the world. We believe that every student has something to offer the world. Every student has something that God has called him or her to do. And to that end, this series, in which we learn about the world from credible speaker experts and together formulate thoughtful responses, is one way to prepare for that renewal. So welcome again to our academic home. We hope you return for a visit to our campus very soon. We are honored to begin our series this year by hosting Mr. Raza Rumi, the director of the Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College in New York. After Mr. Rumi's presentation this afternoon, there will be ample time for questions. We will have microphones ready at each side of the recital hall, where Erica and Michael will be nearby for assistance. You may text your question to the number that we're going to show up on the screen, or use the response cards if you took one as you walked into the recital hall today, and we'll ask that question for you. Please exhibit civility to our guests and hospitality to others by asking respectful and succinct questions. And now, Mr. Michael Van Dennen, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, will introduce our speaker. Michael.
Thank you, Jeff. And on behalf of my colleagues Erica Kubik and Emily Smith and the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, thanks to Calvin University for hosting today. And we welcome all of you here and our live stream guests who are all over the state of Michigan today. The Council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage the world thoughtfully. We do this with the help of 50 local businesses and 11 colleges and universities. We're grateful to all of them. We try to provide programs that are credible, objective, relevant, civil, and compelling. And we hope you agree when you come to our events. To change the world, we believe one must first know the world. Today we say a special thank you to Wolverine as our media series sponsor, to Arconic as our live stream sponsor, and to the Community Media Center and Blue Lake Radio as media sponsors. And we thank the Friends of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan for today's sponsorship. Raza Rumi is a Pakistani policy analyst, journalist, and author. He is the director of the Park Center for Independent Media and teaches in the journalism department at Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York, and also is a visiting faculty member at the Cornell Institute for Public Affairs. Mr. Rumi has also been a fellow at the New America Foundation, United States Institute for Peace, and the National Endowment for Democracy. As a journalist, Mr. Rumi is affiliated with the Daily Times of Pakistan. Earlier, he worked with the Friday Times, Pakistan's foremost weekly paper, as a writer and as an editor. He's also a commentator for several publications, which include Foreign Policy, the New York Times, The Diplomat, The Fair Observer, CNN, and Al Jazeera. In Pakistan, Mr. Rumi also worked in the broadcast media as an analyst and hosted talk shows at Capital TV and Express News. His journalism-related work, especially his broadcast mass media, brought him under the surveillance of terrorists and their patrons in Pakistan. A militia linked to the Taliban attacked him after a television taping in March of 2014, and he narrowly escaped that assassination attempt. Soon after, he moved to the United States. Prior to his foray in journalism and public affairs, Mr. Rumi worked at the Asian Development Bank as a governance specialist. His areas of focus included decentralization, access to justice, and institutional development. Mr. Rumi's work as a public policy practitioner builds on his stint with the government of Pakistan's Administrative Service and the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Kosovo, where he acted as a municipal administrator in charge of local governance. He holds a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from the London School of Economics. His presentation today is entitled Kashmir, Flashpoint Between India and Pakistan. Please join me in welcoming Raza Rumi.
Good afternoon, and it's my pleasure to be here at Calvin University and also meet the great colleagues and from World Affairs Council. It's my second time that I've been invited by the World Affairs Council. I was earlier last year on the West Coast talking about something different though. The topic that I've been given to speak about today is something that you may have picked up in the news cycle last year, and because of the implications that the conflict in Kashmir has, not just for the region but for the world as a whole. Kashmir is a small, Jammu and Kashmir is a small state divided between India and Pakistan, the two countries that became independent in 1947, when the British left India, and they left in a hurry. So they left with many things unfinished and unresolved. And Kashmir is one such dispute which is still festering and lingering on. Both India and Pakistan have claims over this territory, and they have been to war thrice over this dispute. But last year there have been dramatic developments in the region which have led to a heightened alert across the world because both India and Pakistan are nuclear-armed states. And their conflict, if it continues, could escalate and flare up into something that we would all like to avoid. So a bit about the recent history. In 2019, this territory where you can see the little region divided between the two countries, the green is in Pakistan and India is in brown color. So in August of 2019, the Indian government, through a unilateral measure, revoked the special status of Kashmir as an autonomous region and integrated or annexed it as part of the mainstream Indian state. And thereafter, a series of events have been most worrying. So this is an area with more than 7 million population, and the first thing that the Indian government did was to shut down the internet and communications and impose a virtual state of curfew, a state of siege, where the local population was neither allowed to come on the streets, nor kids could go to school for a long time. The local press could not function, and with no internet services, the region was cut off from the entire world, and even with the mainland India. And this flagrant abuse of human rights has been a consistent sort of theme in the contemporary South Asian politics and history. Since 1947, as I mentioned earlier, the dispute between the two countries, it went to the UN, and in 1949, the United Nations resolutions on Kashmir asked both countries to withdraw from the region and let there be a plebiscite. Of course, both the countries blame each other for not complying with the UN conditions, and the plebiscite could never be held. And therefore, the wishes of the Kashmiri people to be part of India or Pakistan or be independent were never sort of acceded to. So that's the current problem as well, that they, both India and Pakistan's nationalisms and their national project does not take into account what the local population may want and for its future and its political autonomy or its future trajectory. And that is a most worrying development since so many years, but particularly since last year, because that state of shutdown and siege continues. Kashmir also happens to be one of the most militarized regions of the world, with on average one security personnel for 8 to 9 citizens. There are more than 500,000 troops stationed in this small place to ensure that there is no protest, that there is no quote-unquote law and order situation, and that people do not talk about the forced occupation of this territory. Almost half of it is also administered by Pakistan, and it is referred to as Azad or Free Kashmir. But it's been a real tragedy for 2 generations that they have grown up under the state of siege and in a highly militarized context. The real issue at hand now is that how do we go forward? India and Pakistan, as I mentioned earlier, have fought 3 wars over this territory. They have been inconclusive. And even last year, there was a skirmish, when the Kashmiri, the paramilitary troops stationed in Kashmir were attacked by the militants in February of last year, almost a year ago. And the Indian government blamed Pakistan for supporting those militants and perpetrating that attack. And thereafter, within a week or so, Indian fighter jets crossed Pakistani territory and bombed ostensibly the hideouts of the militants. Of course, those bombings were not successful because they could not really either find a target, and 2 of the planes were shot down by the Pakistani Air Force, and a pilot was also captured, and later he was sent back to India to de-escalate the situation. But even at that time, there was a major worry globally that this escalation, this conflict, if it further grows, could turn into a nuclear conflict. And that's the, alarming part of this conflict, because both the countries are not willing to talk to each other and sit down on a diplomatic table and find a way forward, because they both consider this territory to be an integral part of their country. So when India and Pakistan became independent in 1947, Pakistan was meant to be a Muslim majority state, and the argument at that time was that the Muslim minority within the United India or the British India could not have its political and economic and cultural rights, and therefore it needed a separate country, and the British ultimately partitioned India in 1947. And Kashmir happens to be, at least the valley happens to be a Muslim majority state. So that's the only Indian state which is a Muslim majority state, and the rest of India is a Hindu majority country. But India's path was, at the start of its journey as an independent country, a secular path. I mean, its constitution is still a secular constitution, and it said that all religions and all peoples of all faiths were equal citizens. citizens, and religion was not to be a basis of citizenship or of the state legal framework or legal structures. On the other hand, Pakistan was always a Muslim state, and over time it evolved into an Islamic nationalist country. The claim over Kashmir was argued and forcefully made based on that religious affinity with the Kashmiris. Of course, there are other factors too. For example, most of the Kashmiris at that time and even now are not in favor of staying with India. I mean, and surveys have shown it, protests and demonstrations have shown it. There have been multiple occasions during the 20th century when there have been uprisings in Kashmir, particularly in the late 1980s, when there was a mass movement against India in the Indian-administered Kashmir. And thereafter, Pakistan earlier was supporting the Kashmiri movement for self-determination, but the militant support to this uprising and this quest for independence is what kind of complicated the issue. And the Indian government then since the 1990s has been consistently accusing Pakistan of fostering militant networks, of sending in militant groups and militias, and the political struggle of Kashmiris then kind of morphed into what the Indians call as a terrorism problem, and which has both denuded and undermined the essential nature of what has been happening for decades, which is basically a quest for self-determination. And self-determination is a right which is very much part of the UN Charter of Human Rights, as well as other international covenants that govern the conduct of states. And that's been the unfortunate history of this region. But since last year, with this clampdown on personal liberties, on internet, on communications, that has kind of made an international has attracted international coverage, and after a long time, many Western publications like the New York Times or the Washington Post or Le Monde or everywhere in Europe, Kashmir and its current status made headlines. And there have been multiple stories about the way people have suffered under this lockdown, people not getting adequate medical attention, not being able to go to hospitals, children dying of snake bites because there's a curfew and they cannot be sent or taken to a hospital for immediate treatment. And that has kind of spurred this current debate. So Pakistan did go to the UN, the Chinese facilitated that. There was kind of an informal meeting of the Security Council in which this matter was raised. And last year, when the Pakistani Prime Minister visited the US and met President Trump, the issue of Kashmir again came up, and President Trump kind of offered to mediate between the two countries to resolve this dispute. Of course, the problem here over the decades that this dispute has played out is that India does not accept any outside intervention or outside mediation. In the 1970s and later, this conflict or dispute was agreed upon as a bilateral dispute between the two countries, but then the two countries don't really engage in diplomatic terms, and they do not really want to talk about it. Whenever there's a diplomatic engagement or bilateral talks start, some other thing happens, either a terror incident or some other dispute on water or trade, and the talks break down. So it's been a real struggle to have these two countries talk about this problem and other disputes which ought to have been resolved by now. had there been some commitment on the part of both the states to find an amicable and a peaceful settlement on this issue. There were efforts made, but none of them bore fruit. And one such proposal was to, the border between India and Pakistan is known as line of control, where since the UN resolutions in 1949, and the idea was to convert the line of control into a permanent international boundary. And now this solution is still very much on the cards, but India has been consistently accusing Pakistan of terrorism. It says it's not going to engage in diplomatic talks because of Pakistan's support for terrorism inside Indian territory. And Pakistan, of course, has a different narrative, which, of course, says that the Kashmiris have been treated unfairly and in an unjust manner, and India should first stop its occupation of the Kashmiri territory, and only then we'll have some kind of a solution moving forward. But aside from these diplomatic squabbles and competing narratives, I think the real issue that we ought to be thinking about is, as I referred to earlier, that in the build-up over the three wars and during the 20th century, both the countries also pursued a nuclear program, and now both countries are in possession of more than 100 nuclear warheads. Of course, the exact number varies, and these figures are difficult to determine because these are very secretive programs. But with these two countries having 100 nuclear warheads, and with this problem continuing and repeating, there's always this danger of nuclear escalation. And I think the Pakistani Prime Minister at the UN last September in 2019 also referred to that if there was no settlement made, then the world could witness a nuclear conflict. But the real thing that we also need to think about is that both India and Pakistan are developing countries. I mean, they have large number of poor people. In fact, South Asia is home to the largest number of malnourished kids across the globe. Some regions in India, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh are almost at par with sub-Saharan Africa in terms of poverty and other lack of entitlements. And should these countries be focusing on that, or should they be just building a nuclear stockpile and constantly warmongering? I mean, it's a larger question that a lot of civil society actors and activists in these countries argue and ask for. But the overarching, sense of nationalistic pride and even the imagination of a nation state with a very strong national security and with the enemy. So in the Pakistani imagination, the Indians are the enemy number one, and you always have to be ready and to fight, and therefore you need a powerful military, and you need nukes, and you need arms and tanks and submarines and whatnot, and even and vice versa. In India, if in the mainstream newspapers, in the media reporting and narratives, you'll also find a similar kind of narrative about Pakistan, that how Pakistan is trying to weaken India, how it's sending terrorism, etc. And the terror incidents that take place in India consistently are not just all perpetrated by Pakistan. There are Maoists in India, there are other separatist movements, there are Naxalites, etc., who also undertake and resort to violence against the state. And all of it has to do with either, weak governance or poverty or, a feeling of marginalization or deprivation in certain parts of India. So, the nation-state narrative hides all of these important details and the imperative of working towards the welfare, mass welfare of people. So what are the consequences of a nuclear conflict between these two states, if this conflict continues? I mean, of course, conservative estimates suggest that, in the case of a nuclear strike, 300 to 400 million people would immediately perish. And with as is the case with the nukes, it's not just going to be limited to the region alone. The nuclear winter that is going to set in after such a conflict is going to sort of engulf the entire globe, leading to radical changes in weather patterns, in agricultural practices, in soil quality, and the long-term debilitating setting in of disease, etc. So it is an alarming thought, and that is why I think the world needs to focus on this, and we should care about this conflict, because a diplomatic settlement ought to be thought about, before it gets out of hand. But then there are other important areas where bilateral cooperation and better relations with India and Pakistan are much needed. The first one, of course, has to do with climate change. India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh happen to be among the top 10 countries vulnerable to climate change. There are already signs of that in the past decade or so, in fact more than a decade, with the frequency of natural disasters like floods, earthquakes. Parts of Bangladesh are likely to submerge in the next 2 decades due to the rising sea levels, and that's the location, the geographic reality of Bangladesh, where it's going to suffer. A small country, Maldives, which is right at it's not too visible here, but it's in the Indian Ocean, is actually just going to disappear. It's a series of small islands that constitute a country. It's the smallest country in South Asia. And it's just going to go away. And they're already thinking of what is to be done in terms of the population and resettlement. So and India-Pakistan conflict is so, at one level, so, weird, that they even are fighting on a glacier. So a glacier named Siachen Glacier in the Himalayan glacial range, right at perhaps world's highest altitude for a war zone since 1984, when India occupied part of that glacier, and Pakistan then jumped in and also stationed its troops to guard the rest of the territory. They have stationed troops. I mean, many soldiers have died in blizzards, in extreme weather conditions. They come back virtually debilitated, destroyed, after serving there. And it's also extremely expensive, other than the fact that it's polluting the environment there and causing and furthering and accelerating the glacial melt. The rate of glacial melt, across the globe has increased in the last 40 to 50 years, but in the Himalayan region, it has doubled, according to climate scientists. And that, of course, is a major cause of concern, because, as I mentioned earlier, India and Pakistan, South Asia is home to 1/5 of world's humanity. Between India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, it's close to 2 billion people. And it's their futures, it's their livelihoods, it's their health, it's their sustainability at stake. And if these countries, and climate change cannot be fought alone by one country or even by regions for that matter, it has to be a global fight. But in the South Asian context, given shared water resources, given shared glaciers, shared flora and fauna and weather conditions, fighting together and cooperating on that front is even more imperative. And I hope that that gets the attention of the policymakers and the ruling classes in these two countries. But I think coming back to Kashmir, the urgent question now has to do with the human rights emergency in the conflict zone. So I mentioned earlier, 7 million people under siege. It's perhaps world's, most greatest shutdown in the recent history, where you just, block off all forms of communications and impose a curfew and create a state of siege. And, injustice anywhere is a threat to all of us. Human rights matter. They are universal, indivisible, global. Most countries, including India and Pakistan, have signed up on the charter, UN Charter on Human Rights, and the various covenants and sub-charters under that larger legal umbrella. And the UN has to play a role in getting this immediate problem resolved or addressed, at least, because it is going to further create a ground. So the more repressive tactics the Indian state uses in the Kashmir region, the more alienation it's going to create, the more, once the siege is gone, more and more people are going to protest, leading to further violence, leading to, further accusations of Pakistan supporting that particular violence, etc. So we have a very, very problematic and, some would say intractable situation at hand, but certainly the international community has to play a role. President Trump has offered, I mentioned earlier, but then we have multilateral avenues like the UN Security Council, like the European Union, and such other multilateral bodies that can push both the countries to, enter into a diplomatic engagement. And, often what succeeds in this context are the back channel or backdoor diplomatic efforts, track 2 or track 3 type engagement. Unfortunately, even that is not existing. I mean, I used to be part of track 2 efforts earlier, a decade ago, but in the last few years, even those have broken down, and there's such a level of distrust and lack of communication between the two countries that, that makes it even worse for the future portents. I think I'll also mention how others. So China is a big actor in this region. As you can see, all the red is the Chinese territory, and it also parts of the Jammu and Kashmir region borders China. China, of course, has its own take. I mean, India and China are rivals in the security arena, but they're partners in economic cooperation. They have been trading with each other, and their mutual trade has hit $100 billion mark annually. So there's an opportunity where the Chinese can also, along with the United States, play a role. But I think for that to happen, there needs to be building up of public opinion, international public opinion, to handle this issue and tackle this issue as a clear threat to global security and global welfare for all of us. What also makes it very difficult, why the Indian government did resort to this revocation of special status, because this special status was granted in the, after independence of India and Pakistan to Jammu and Kashmir, with a view that at some point in future, the final status of this autonomous region would be figured out. India has a hyper-nationalist government, which, as I mentioned earlier, contrary to the Indian secular tradition and its constitution, wants to turn India into a Hindu majoritarian state, a kind of a mirror image of Pakistan as a Muslim majoritarian country. And so because Kashmir is a Muslim majority state, so, its supporters are kind of cheering on this act of annexing it by dicta or by a unilateral revocation of that special constitutional clause. And that makes it worse because within the mainstream Indian political opinion, within the mainstream media, there has not been much condemnation of this limiting of rights, and even the human rights situation within India does not get that kind of attention. The matter also went to the Indian Supreme Court, and it refused to give an injunction on this act. And of course, there are many brave voices in the Indian civil society and some politicians who consistently talk about it, and they have been sending fact-finding missions to the region to look at how people are faring under this new constitutional and legal arrangement. But those voices are few and far between, and much needs to be done to overcome this. So in summary, I think we are in a kind of a tight spot here. More and more awareness globally is needed, more and more ways to get some kind of intervention through international community, some mediation, some backdoor diplomatic engagement is required to address this perennial and festering conflict. And with the nuclear nature of these two states and their military prowess, it is even more alarming, not just for the peoples of India and Pakistan and South Asia, but for the world as a whole. So I'll end here because I think we have to end at 1.
So we'll have some numbers on the screen that if you are viewing remotely, you can text in questions, or if you're shy here in the auditorium, you can text a question. But we also will take questions if you raise your hands here in the recital hall. While people are mulling over this, I thought maybe we could start with one question just to think about the issue of human rights. You know, as you were talking, I was struck by this thought that for many Americans, the feeling of being under total lockdown, or as you said, being in a highly militarized context is so, alien of a concept to how we live our daily lives. And I know you gave some context to that, but perhaps you could talk about some of the things that we take for granted here in the U.S. that would just not be possible in Kashmir right now.
Yeah, I mean, mobile telephone to begin with, having a cell phone access, going out of your house to a market, or doing your everyday, running errands and buying groceries, or just to be on the internet making a Skype call. So I've met this gentleman. I was in DC for a day. And I met this gentleman who has not, so he has sisters and brothers in the Indian-held Kashmir, and he has not spoken to them since August. And he says he doesn't know how they are, how they're faring, and, so it's the very basic, freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, I guess, which have been completely shut down. So some of the freedoms, as you said, which are taken for granted in countries like US or many other countries of the world, are simply not there since August of 2019.
I've already got a couple questions, so I'll ask two, and then maybe we can see some from the live audience. Thinking about China, is there concern that an independent Kashmir would come strongly under the influence of China? And also, let me go back to, you guys are very good with your questions. Thinking about youth, because the population in Southeast Asia is younger. Yeah. What are their opinions, both in India, Pakistan, Kashmir?
Yeah, so I think the Chinese fear from the Indian security point of view has been articulated many times. And certainly an independent Kashmir would ultimately get in the Chinese orbit or its zone of influence. But those things are just speculative in nature. We don't know what happens when it happens. But I think there is a strategic reason why India is so unwilling to let go of Kashmir is the Chinese factor, because it feels that it is a state that will border China, and therefore it will have implications for its security. And Pakistan is already very good on very good terms with China for decades now. They're very strong military and economic partners. But these considerations, I suppose, at the end of the day, are secondary if we believe in human rights, if we believe in political rights, if we believe in political self-determination, then I suppose these considerations should theoretically be secondary to those. But then in a realistic or a realist sense of international relations, it's the powerful country and the powerful who set the narrative. So this Chinese fear has been kind of sold in as a major narrative within mainstream India. On the second question about the youth, South Asia is a very young country. Just for context, 70% of Pakistan's population is below the age of 30. And nearly half of Indian population is what we would categorize as youth. And in Kashmir, that has been another problem for the Indian state in terms of administering and managing it, has been this youth protests, continued youth protests, and sadly some of the youth have also been radicalized in this struggle against the Indian rule there. And that has again given an opportunity for India to further clamp down on the Kashmiris, saying there are militants and there are terrorists in this region, and therefore we need to go in and send more troops. It's unimaginable that it's such a small region with such a small population. You have, hundreds and thousands of military and paramilitary and police and stationed there. So obviously there's something that they're trying to control, and what is that they're trying to control? It's political yearning and political aspirations of the local people. So I think the youth are very much, surveys, these are dated, some are decade old. So the surveys clearly showed that the youth wanted to be independent. They wanted independent Kashmir, neither with India nor with Pakistan. And that's what a lot of Kashmiris says, that, where's our voice? Where is our agency? Why are we considered as a limb or as an essential part of one country or the other? We should ultimately have a voice and say in what's our future.
Mr. Rumi, we had a speaker last year, Stacey Davenport of the Nuclear Arms Control Association, and she was asked right here in this room, what keeps you up at night? It's probably North Korea, right? She said, no, it's India and Pakistan. And she said that because she said that the military in both countries have delegated potential use of these arms to generals. We think in our country there's a briefcase with a code and there's all kinds of ways to stop that from happening, but she seemed to imply that in both countries, people further down in the military could have the chance to opportunity or permission to use it. Can you comment on that a little bit, the concern about the military of either country resorting to limited use?
So, I think that's a real, to be honest, it's not my nuclear security, is not my area, so I'd hesitate to make some definitive statements, but certainly there is a clear problem with the way nuclear programs are managed and who takes decisions ultimately. So even if it is some adventurous general or a kind of crazy politician pressing the nuclear button, it could unleash, the unthinkable consequences for the people and for the world. But I think there have been reports in the media on both the countries with their insufficient or kind of problematic security and safety of the nuclear warheads. So I think there was a recent report about the Indian program, and then there was a report earlier in the Atlantic about the Pakistani program. So these things come in, but in summary, in short, it should be a concern, and it is a concern.
I've got several somewhat related questions, so I'll try and group them together, some from our partners at Ferris State University, and also Northern Michigan University. One question is, well, what's so valuable about Kashmir? Is it really just about a sense of national narrative, or are there resources? And another person asked about the glaciers and glacier runoff and water issues, and so maybe talking about water issues in both India and Pakistan.
Yeah. So I was talking about, I did briefly touch upon the climate change challenges, and one of the challenges there is the estimated scarcity of water resources with the growing population. India is already close to 1.3 billion people, right? Pakistan is 220 million people, and the population growth has not yet come down to that level, so you have more and more pressure on scarce natural resources. And Kashmir, one of the key reasons by both the countries have been fighting and are so want to keep it under their control, is that the river sources emanate from Kashmir, and so that's a big contest there. So it's partly the water resources as well, and partly the strategic angle that we earlier discussed. But above all, it is this nationalist identity and nationalist rhetoric that both the countries are hostage to. So in the local language, Pakistan refers to Kashmir as its jugular vein, so important to the national imagination, and the Indians refer to it as an inseparable limb of the Indian Union. So you can imagine, even in terms of linguistics, how the region is framed and seen as this: if it is cut off, or if it becomes independent, or if it goes away, the entire national edifice crumbles. Of course, this is all rhetoric, as all nation states do. They create and spin fiction, both in terms of what the territorial and geographical status holds, but also in terms of the history and how they imagine themselves. So I think it's a mix of all these factors. Yeah.
You guys are bringing in a lot of questions via text, so I'm going to ask something that might be, when we think about, we've talked a little bit about China and what their role to play in the region might be. Can you maybe speak a little bit about neutral countries like Nepal and Sri Lanka, and how are they responding to what's happening?
So yeah, I think Nepal and Sri Lanka, they have not really. So we have what we call a regional forum called SAARC, which is the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, SAARC, SAARC. Unfortunately, it's a moribund organization, mainly because of India-Pakistan dispute. Because if these two are not talking to each other, they don't attend the regional conferences. They keep on canceling. So in the past few years, regional moods have been, when it was created, there was much hope that it would kind of foster better engagement, better communications, better ties, economic, cultural, political, between the South Asian countries. But the big two have undermined that hope with the SAARC. So Nepal has been fairly neutral, but Nepal is also traditionally has been kind of under Indian influence and orbit, partly because of the economic dependency that Nepal has. A lot of its food and stuff comes from India into the country. A lot of its labor works in India. So there these days, Sri Lanka, on the other hand, tries and keeps a balance. It has good relations with both the countries. But if you remember, Sri Lanka was mired in a long, drawn-out ethnic war, civil war for more than 27 years. So it was focusing more inwards than looking at the region and outside conflicts. But I think they do have a role. I think India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Maldives, they all have a role in making efforts to get the two problem kids in the region talk to each other and sort their issues out. But I don't know how that would happen and when that would happen.
Sometimes Pakistan is looked at a little bit skeptically by U.S. Audiences because Osama bin Laden was able to live there for so long and harbored, some people would say. But Pakistan borders Afghanistan, right? And the country absorbed thousands and thousands and thousands of refugees from that war. What impact has all that had on the country and how it sees its relationships with India and other countries?
Okay, that's a complicated question. No, I think because it's Pakistan has been an ally of the U.S. in almost all its global security adventures, if I may call that. During the Cold War, Pakistan was a frontline ally, and then when Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and Pakistan worked with the U.S. and the Saudis to train the whole generation of mujahideen, the jihadists, to go and fight the evil Soviet Empire. And during that time, Pakistan was hosting millions of refugees. We have more than 2 million refugees actually. Many have gone back though. And in the third phase, post 9/11, when the US invaded Afghanistan. So in all these three phases, we've had a history of very close partnership, military and economic, of course. But I think in the last phase, it became kind of more complicated because of Pakistan's security estimates. So the U.S. initially, the U.S. of course, when it invaded Afghanistan and was trying to defeat Al-Qaeda and weaken the Afghan Taliban, it did not, it kind of also encouraged India to take interest in that, and India found a space to make inroads there. For Pakistan's, security policy, they are very concerned with having India on the eastern side and Afghanistan on the western side, and if in both the sides, it's a very archaic military thinking that if you are surrounded by two hostile states, then you're screwed, right? So it's always tried to have a friendly government in Afghanistan or a government which it can influence. So that's where the US and Pakistan's security worldview diverged. But to the support to Afghan Taliban, so the US consistently blamed Pakistan for supporting the Afghan Taliban because Pakistan viewed Afghan Taliban as their allies in the region. And now as ironies unfold, the US is talking to the Taliban itself to get a pullout. So it's a long story. But in short, the Indian factor does play a lot of role in Pakistan's Afghan policy, and that has been in part contributed to the skepticism, as you mentioned. But bin Laden and other Al-Qaeda people, militants crossing over into Pakistan, that happened after the US invasion of Afghanistan, because it's a very long, 1,600 kilometers long, porous border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, it's not fenced. Now there's some fencing going on, and basically you can just travel and cross easily. No one would even know what's going on.
Sir, I wonder if you could comment on what the likelihood is of this conflict over Kashmir reappearing on the agenda of the United Nations, either in the Security Council or in the General Assembly or by way of a peacekeeping force in Kashmir. What do you think of that?
So they have a small peacekeeping mission, by the way, in Kashmir. The UN has stationed that, I think, since 1949. It's very small, and recently, I think, if I remember correctly, India said that it's not going to host it anymore. And perhaps that's been further diluted and weakened. The possibility of this coming up on the UN Security Council agenda, as you know, UN Security Council, the 5 big members, powerful member states, US, Russia, China, France, they call the shots on what happens on the Security Council. And they are evenly divided. China almost always takes Pakistan's side and backs Pakistan. Russia, France have backed the Indians. The UK and US kind of try and handle and work with both the countries, because they have good terms and interests with both the countries. So until the big 5 don't decide among themselves that they are not going to veto any placement of this conflict on the Security Council agenda, it's not going to happen. And that's why I think the US and UK have a very important role, the US in particular. And President Trump has said it twice, as I mentioned in my talk, and that was hailed in Pakistan as, because historically the State Department and the presidents in the US have not really named Kashmir. So President Trump overnight became very popular in Pakistan for his offer of mediation in Kashmir. And so I guess that they will have to play some kind of an extraordinary or a more determined role in getting it either on the UN or even through a multilateral diplomatic process.
We have time for one last question, even though I've gotten just a ton of questions through my phone. But let's think about what we can do. What can individuals do to take part in the world, be engaged, and help the situation in Kashmir?
Wow, it's a tough one. So, first of all, I think that we have to recognize that we are global citizens. It's just, we are not just consumers of transnational products like Apple iPhones or iMacs or whatever. We are actually global citizens. The world never has the world been so integrated, and never have communications been so instant. Whatever happens in one part of the world immediately is reported and known to the other parts. So I think living in this kind of an age, we all have a role. So, we have the digital technologies now, we have the social media, I guess knowing more about it, reading and keeping yourself updated about what's happening in this region and other troublesome regions of the world as well, maybe the first starting point, And then, of course, more and more voices matter. The more people speak up for human rights and justice and causes for individual freedoms, it will have an impact. But I guess in the U.S. context, you can always, the U.S. Congress has had 2 hearings on Kashmir. in the last few months, where professors and experts from the US, from the UK, from India have come and testified before the Congress on what is going on. So I guess reaching out to your congressman or congresswoman, reaching out to your local elected officials, making some noise about this issue is important. I mean, after all, we want a safe world for ourselves and our future generations.
Let's thank Raza Rumi for a great conversation.